It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about one of my favorite subjects, six-party talks. I agree with what Dr. Yoon has, many of the points that Dr. Yoon has just made. I would, however, like to clarify one issue, which is I don't have any stock in the six-party talks. I mean, if someone's got a better idea, let's hear about it. But when someone comes forward with a better idea than the six-party talks, I think that person does need to address some problems with coming up with a better idea. The first problem is, if we come up with a new mechanism, I think we have to explain what will happen when North Korea then says, okay, we'll start from zero. That's what we'd like to start from. That is, forget about what we've done in the past, let's start anew. So I think anyone coming up with a new mechanism has got to assure that the progress that has been made to date, and I admit that it's been fairly thin, but they need to figure out a way that that progress can be kept if you're going to introduce a new mechanism. I would argue that's not easy to do. Secondly, we have a number of UN sanctions against the North Koreans. We have a number of bilateral sanctions. We have a number of things we've done in the past, whether it's military exercises, etc. I think when you bring up a new mechanism, you're also going to have to deal with the question of whether the North Koreans would demand that all those sanctions go away, because after all, we're starting afresh without the burden of the past. So if you really want to get rid of all those sanctions, if you really want to get rid of the consensus that developed among the other five, I think one way to do that would be to bring in a new mechanism. In short, I think a new mechanism is fraught with dangers in terms of taking us back in time rather than forward. I think the North Koreans would be delighted to have a new mechanism, which is another reason why probably one should not be in favor of a new mechanism. The reason they'd be delighted is I don't think the North Koreans really want to make a decision to denuclearize. And so if you bring in a new mechanism, that simply allows them more time in which not to make a decision. I think too that it's not so much a question of whether they're going to use that time to further develop their nuclear weapons. Minister Grachev made the point that it would take them a long time to put a weapon on a missile. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that the North Koreans think they could do that fairly quickly. So they probably would like the additional time, and they would like to start from zero and kind of move ahead very slowly. So I think there are a lot of problems with switching mechanisms, and so I would suggest that maybe we ought to sort of look at where we are and see where we can build on what we've got. Now, I'd like to explain, because I think it might be useful to explain to people why we have this joint statement. What was that all about? What did that have to do with how we were trying to make progress? And the concept of the joint statement was that the North Koreans really didn't want to give up their nuclear weapons. So to get them to say something like CBID on the first day of the six-party talks was frankly a bridge too far. That is not really possible. So what we tried to do is set up an overall joint statement which would, in essence, have the North Koreans agreeing to their complete abandonment of nuclear weapons. Although, boy, you should have seen the discussion about what some of these terms meant. But we were pretty satisfied that to put in the first paragraph, the DPRK committed to abandoning all nuclear weapons and existing nuclear programs and returning at an early date to the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and to IAEA safeguards. We felt to get that in the agreement, in the joint statement, was a very important point to commit the North Koreans to a process of complete abandonment of their weapons. people actually were concerned, why aren't we using the CBID language at the time? And the answer was it had become so emotionally charged, if I can use that expression, that we really didn't feel we could get that, and so we went with something that we very much felt was an equivalent. So we thought it was important to get the North Koreans on the record there. And what I also thought was important was in producing the joint statement, it was done essentially with the Chinese, first of all, agreeing to it. I remember when I talked to Wu Dawei about this, and I mentioned that before the Dayton Peace Accords, we had actually done a couple of things called basic agreed principles. It was called agreed principles. And the agreed principle is how we were going to divide Bosnia. And then we had another piece of paper called further agreed principles, which was to show how Bosnia was to be one state. And then only after everyone got used to that, we went to Dayton and filled in the details. So that was the concept. Wu Dawei said to me, we should think about a kind of step-by-step process. That is, it's too difficult to expect the North Koreans to agree to something in advance. Let's just go step-by-step and kind of get there slowly. At that point, I told him an old joke about a Polish party first secretary in the 1950s, a guy named Władysław Gomułka. And Gomułka famously got up in front of a crowd in Krakow, and he said to the crowd, comrades, just a few years ago, our country was on the very edge of a deep abyss, and today I'm here to tell you that we have taken an important step forward. Meaning, for those of you who it's too early in the morning to get the joke, meaning that if you take a step forward, you can actually slip. If you try to do this on a step-by-step basis, you can just slip into an abyss and never get any further. And actually, Wu Dawei kind of got the joke, better than some of the people in the room here, and then managed to was bought on to the idea of let's sort of lay out in short where we're going, and then let's turn this into an implementing exercise of how to get there. Now, I think the problem has been that in the implementation, because we didn't have time frames, that no matter what the Chinese chair tried to do, we could not get the North Koreans to deal on these time frames, and so the thing worked very slowly. And I think any revival of negotiations with the North Koreans has to include some stronger sense of not only of laying out time frames, but also of ensuring that those time frames are actually met, and that there are penalties for not reaching agreements on these time frames. I think the basic problem with what we did with the joint statement was that going forward we could never kind of lay out proper time frames. But I would say the advantage of the joint statement is that it laid out not only the obligations of North Korea, but the obligations of everyone else in what we would expect when we finally achieve the destination. For me, it was very important because within Washington, believe it or not, we had some disagreements over how to manage the end game. And there are many people who did not feel, for example, that we should ever arrive at a situation where we would want to have diplomatic recognition of North Korea. And so to put those elements of sort of the end game into the statement, we thought it was very important trying to end that debate in Washington. So it was not just for the North Koreans we were saying, hey, you are going to end up in denuclearization. It was also for people in Washington, which was to say, we are going to end up recognizing this anathema of a country. So I think it was very important to put all these things there. We tried to address what the North Koreans expressed to be their concern. And there's an old expression from psychology, which is you can never get enough of what you don't want. And I think the problem that we felt throughout this was that the North Koreans really didn't want many of these things. What they wanted were nuclear weapons. And so, again, that goes back to the very fundamental question of whether we have a North Korea that really wants to negotiate. I mention that because the South Koreans put together a very elaborate and, I might add, expensive idea of how to provide electricity to the North Koreans. And this was actually included in the joint statement. So all the elements of where we would end up were there. And so whether this is the same thing as a grand bargain or whether it involves some sequencing of events, I think the concept was to get everyone understanding that at the end you will have responsibilities. The sequencing was also a very difficult problem because you had people in Washington saying, okay, first they denuclearize, and then we will do our things. Well, I convinced people in Washington that that wasn't, that was something that was not going to fly, and therefore we needed some sort of balance of what elements would get done and when. So we tried to put together charts. Again, Washington wanted our obligations moved to the right and North Korean obligations moved to the left. The North Koreans wanted our obligations well to the left and their obligations way at the end. So these were sequencing issues, but I think they're really ones that could be resolved if the North Koreans were really prepared to negotiate. At the end of the day, I felt that the issue was that the United States was indeed prepared to do the things we said we were going to do. I think the ROK was prepared to do those things. I think the problem was North Korea was not prepared to denuclearize, and that is why the process failed. Again, the fact that they were not prepared to denuclearize, in my opinion, suggests that this was not a problem of mechanism, because I think we had a lot of flexibility on the six-party mechanism. The one concern I had was that we were not able to implement timeframes, as I mentioned earlier, and in not being able to implement timeframes, we lost something that is often talked about in negotiation, difficult to measure, a phenomena called momentum. That is, you could never get one element to move fast enough such that it would have an effect on the next element's implementation. So we never had any synergism between the various phases and never any momentum that could be created between the different phases. I think I think as we look forward and looked for ways to put together the six-party process, and again, if people want to add other parties or subtract some parties, I must say there was discussion that maybe six is too many. But there was also arguments that it was not enough when you talk to some of our European Union colleagues. So did I get the 2-minute warning? I'm sorry about that. So I think what we needed, what we need to do is figure out that as we go forward, we are able to get the North Koreans, again, to get us to the status quo ante, to get the inspectors back in, to get sort of where we were before the thing broke down. I think that has to be a sort of minimal requirement. And then I think there needs to be some effort at their restating, and we can all restate for the record the September joint statement, and to make sure that that's not territory we're going to have to take once again. So I look forward to a more interactive format when we get to the Q's and A's on this. Thank you.